introduction. Okay. I'm going to start with the introduction from the actual essay. And then I'm going to back up and explain what I just said. So I hope that will work. William Stevenson, the inventor of Q methodology, remarked that Q's forward movement has been blocked primarily by its being regarded as a branch of advanced statistics rather than as the basis of a subjective science focused on behavior. Had he lived to see the current growth in applications of Q, he would perhaps have been encouraged that while widespread use of Q has perhaps been slowed by recurring statistical questions, it has by no means been blocked. At the same time, struggles with the statistical nature of Q persist. A recent debate in the pages of operant subjectivity and continuing on the Q method electronic mailing list, beginning with Brown 2017, revolves in part around a question or perhaps an assumption that has been around since at least 1967. In Chapter 4, Technique and Method of Stephen R. Brown's Political Subjectivity, he includes the following. Horn, 1967, for example, asserts that the procedures utilized to reach a factor structure must be operationally independent of the investigator's substantive hypotheses, so as to avoid Procrustean solutions, and therefore questions the confidence that we can have in any structure arrived at by means of subjective rotational procedures. Of course, Brown raises this point so that he can answer it, and at some length, he shows that simple structure is, in the context of Q, an absolute interjected into a situation for which it may be inapplicable. Brown's arguments revolve around the uniqueness of the goals of Q and the special procedures that have been incorporated with those goals in mind. Brown's argument has not convinced those who believe Horn's advice ought to apply anywhere factor analysis is used, without any special pleadings allowed for Q. One of several assumptions behind Horn's assertion is that factor structure is the endpoint of a factor analytic study, or at least has causal control over the steps that follow, so that the structure of rotated factors is treated as a destination in which we need to have confidence, rather than as an intersection, one of many possible ways to get to a solution that has already been bounded by the raw data. Another related assumption is that solutions driven by the investigator's substantive hypotheses would be intrinsically different and less trustworthy than a purely technique-based solution. These assumptions of Horn's are not of merely historical interest. They are implicit in the current arguments against the use of judgmental rotation. The criticisms only make sense if it is assumed that the validity and reliability of an interpretation at the end of a Q study are sensitive to decisions made at the rotation phase. Perhaps this is based in turn on the supposition that the specific sorted statements that will become most salient to interpreting a factor depend on factor rotation. That is, assuming that factor interpretation will be done fairly in terms of the statements that give meaning to the factor, the interpretation is sensitive to factor rotation through the mechanism of changing the set of statements brought into focus. A more aggressive form of the same assumption is that using manual rotation in Q is a means for introducing known or unknown bias from the researcher. According to Akhtar Dinesh, the common use of manual rotation is not scientifically sound, as it can easily result in an unreliable and invalid solution. And the practice of rotating based on a search for clarity in interpretation is very similar to what is called data fishing, data dredging, or p-hacking. This essay proposes to take an empirical look at whether these assumptions are justified. As the final message in the most recent discussion of these issues, Wolf asked, by the way, hi, Amanda, I saw you were here. Ask the Q method list, is anyone aware of an analysis in which the researcher presented two or more fully interpreted analyses of the same data or portions of the data without the need to say that one of them was best? Up to this writing, her question remains unanswered, but it will be addressed in what follows. One real data set analyzed in about 10 different ways, with comments and explanation testing whether conclusions in Q are sensitive to issues of rotation and related analytical decisions. Beyond the current debate, such an extended example is potentially useful as a teaching tool and as a demonstration of the consequences of investigator decisions about number of factors, extraction techniques, and especially rotation. Okay, I'm going to switch to another screen. Demystifying factor rotation. This is a second introduction to the same information, in which I hope to back up and make sure everybody is tracking with us. The first step in demystifying factor rotation is clarity about what is a factor. And because of overlap with our method factor analysis, some things we call factors are borrowed ideas from that tradition. But it's extremely helpful to keep in mind a Q-specific conception of a factor. In Q, a factor is ultimately a shared point of view made observable by a composite sort. This is our destination. Any other factor is just a waypoint. A composite sort is a weighted average of two or more similar raw data sorts, which manifests their underlying shared subjectivity. This is the kind of factor that is our destination in Q. This is an image worth holding in mind. What you're looking at is the composite sort for the first factor of unrotated PCA of the data set that we'll be talking about. You can see that there are specific statements at the -4 end and the +4 end, and these give this a specific character that is unchanging. We'll look at that further. When you hear factor, think a shared point of view made observable by a composite sort. Could this be a factor? We sometimes call the people who did the sorts that loaded together a factor. This is a well-established usage, but it is more symbolic and almost shorthand for what we really mean. The factor is not the group itself, but the underlying agreement that made them a group through the operation of sorting. What about factors in our analysis printouts? How do they relate to the preferred conceptualization of a factor? In Q, these numerical representations of factors are precursors rather than our destination. These are to our ultimate factor as a cake recipe is to a cake. The extremely useful plot on the left superimposes axes that represent factors. But this is like a picture on a box of cake mix. It lets us know what flavors of cake are available, but excuse me, it's not yet cake. This is the factor, fully baked, ready for tasting. Holding this firmly in mind resists the confusion brought in by inappropriately applying our method ideas about factor analysis in Q method. If this is a factor, how does it relate to factor rotation? Rotation chooses the candidate factors that most directly focus on our research question and are most readily interpretable. Factor rotation is the mechanism of selecting which sorts will be averaged together and with what relative weights to make the weighted average composite sort that is our factor. Whether done judgmentally or using a computer algorithm, since the final rotated factors are composites created by averaging selected sorts, nothing done in rotation can produce a factor that is anything other than an average of existing sorts. Remember how we got here. Where did the magic happen? A reminder of the 5 stages of a Q study. We've got the Q set, the P set, the Q sort, then the factor analysis, and finally interpretation. Each of these has a number of sub-steps involved. The Q set involves identifying the concourse, coming up with a sampling scheme, sampling the concourse. The P set involves selecting who should sort and under what conditions of instruction. The Q sort itself is the sorting procedure that results in observable data. Factor analysis involves extraction, selection, rotation, flagging, and compositing. And then comes interpretation. Where the magic happens, it is not step 4. It's not the factor analysis and rotation. All the answers about shared subjectivity to be understood through data analysis are locked in at step 3, the sorting step. When the sorting is done, everything after that is just explication of what has already happened. The magic, quote unquote, that makes a great study is in steps 1 and 2. An engaging, non-trivial concourse, sampled well, and engaged sorters yields an engaging, non-trivial study. If you start with a bad, uninteresting concourse or a bad sample of the concourse, if you add to that uninterested sorters who've barely ever thought of the topic under examination, you're going to get a very unengaging study, and there is nothing you can do about it after the sorting is done. There's no way to rescue it with factor analysis. The magic happens in step 1 and step 2. Rotation is not magic, nor is it about algorithmic rules. Rotation is about focus and clarity. Rotation, combined with flagging, determines which individual sorts will be averaged together to make up the interpretable factor, the composite sort. Rotation also determines the way individual sorts are weighted in the weighted average that makes up the composite sort, the factor. Our scientific objective at this stage is bringing into focus an interpretable composite of the specific sorts that shed light on our research questions. Okay, that was a little bit of drinking from a fire hose. Are you guys okay? Still with me? Okay, I'm going to share another screen. This is KinQ Analysis, the online web-based Q analysis program from Sean Venisek. And I have loaded in here the data behind the essay that we're talking about. You can see here are the statements. And here are the sorts. And so far, nothing else has been done. So I'm going to click Begin Analysis. That loads a correlation matrix. The correlation matrix can be thought of as a measure of closeness between sorters, or to reverse it, a measure of distance between sorters. At factor extraction, I'm going to extract principal components, and we'll talk more about that later. Factor rotation. I'm going to choose to look at 3 factors for potential rotation and click on judgmental rotation and look at the first 2 factors. Okay, friends, this is a scatter plot of factor space. Factor 1 is vertical, factor 2 is the horizontal. And whenever you do unrotated principal components, your first factor is going to be the overall agreement among everybody. And the second factor will be the disagreement within the major agreement. So this distance above the 0 point is the largest factor. This breadth from sort 14 to sort 3 is the second largest factor. We can rotate, and when we rotate counterclockwise, we're actually rotating the axes a little bit to the left, but then straightening the picture so that it looks like all of the dots move to the right. So as we rotate the axes counterclockwise, when we get just about here, we have achieved what is automatically done for us by Varamax rotation. It takes what used to be the negative end of the second factor combined with the first factor to make a new factor made up of these that are green here, and another factor based on those that were the farthest to the right, and these in the middle were not cleanly loaded on either factor. They are mixed cases. This is not a tragedy. These mixed cases can be understood as agreeing somewhat with factor 1 and somewhat with factor 2, and they are somewhere in the middle. All of that to say, we have changed nothing. Look, 14 and 6 are right next to each other. 14 and 6 are next to each other because of the way they sorted and because of their high correlation in the way they treated statements. When I rotate this, 14 and 6 are going to stay next to each other. And there is no rotation I can possibly come up with that will separate them. They will always be right next to each other. So rotation is not magic. It's just choosing to look at the same data from a different point of view. It's choosing to focus. If I wanted to focus on these number 2 and number 3 sorters, I could pass one of the factors directly between those 2 points. If I want to focus on 14 and 6, I can pass one of the factors directly through those points. In doing so, I'm making a decision about what I'm interested in. I'm not changing the data in any way. Okay. Now back to the paper. An example study for investigative reanalysis. I'm going to have to go quickly because there was never any hope of getting through this whole paper in a half hour, but I do want to get farther than this. So the example study for investigative reanalysis, just to go quickly through this, it was a real study from one of my PhD students who was looking at pastors in Ghana who all said that they agreed about the same doctrines and yet behaved in very different ways in the way they led their churches. And so he came up with a set of 35 statements, and they were based on themes drawn from the biblical book of Jude. And then he had them sorted by 20 subjects who were pastors representing major Pentecostal or charismatic churches in a major city in Ghana. The first analysis is competing real-world solutions. It would be possible to look at the scree plot and inappropriately apply an R methodology rule of thumb and say, oh, there's only one factor here. And if you only look at one factor, you get analysis A. And analysis A, just to scroll down to the, you don't even get to see this plot if you choose analysis A, because you have to have two factors to even get a scatter plot. But what we're doing is looking just at the numbers and looking just at factor one. And factor one says that the +4 statements most strongly affirmed are statements 24 and 17. The Holy Spirit guides us to pray according to God's will. The church's mandate is to make disciples of all nations. The -4 statements most strongly denied are 8 and 9. The gospel is that Christ died to make us rich and successful. I'm a Christian because I speak in tongues. The overall agreement represented by A1 affirms Pentecostal doctrines and denies a couple of common errors, and this is no surprise. All of our sorters self-identify as Orthodox Pentecostals. Further insight might be gained by looking at the overall pattern of all statements as treated by A1. But of interest here is not deeper interpretation at this stage, but to note the key statements to which such an interpretation would need to give special attention. These can then be compared with statements that come to the fore using other numbers of factors and rotations in other analyses of the same data. In other words, if you want to take a study and do a reanalysis of the study all the way through to the interpretation phase, when you get to the statements, if you're using the same statements, you're going to have the same interpretation. So we don't have to go beyond finding out whether we've got the same statements. I hope everybody's on board with me. I can't see you. Okay, my second analysis B, oh, by the way, I would say that analysis A is pretty useless. By using the rule of thumb that says use the scree plot and throw away everything else besides the strongest factor, we actually throw away the information that was driving the study in the first place. And that's about the disagreement within the overall agreement. If you don't look at factor 2, you don't even get to look at that. So analysis B is 2-factor unrotated PCA. And this is what I just showed you on the KIN-Q page, but this one came from PQ method. We have the first factor representing the overall agreement among all of these pastors, which is the distance above zero in the vertical direction. But there's more going on. There is a disagreement. There is something that person number 6 sees differently than person number 3. Otherwise, they'd be a lot closer together. We want to know what that is. And so therefore, we can look at this factor, this second factor, the horizontal factor, as a bipolar factor, where these are on the negative end and these are on the positive end. And we can do that just from unrotated PCA, but that's probably not the most convenient way to do it. Nonetheless, it's an option. The next option is, I need to stop here and say, factor B1 predictably turns out to be identical to factor A1. The same statements are going to show up if you do a 1-factor versus a 2-factor unrotated principal components analysis. The difference is now we have a second factor, and the +4 statements most strongly affirmed by the positive end are 4, not paying my tithes and offerings as robbing God, and 15, the fruit of the Holy Spirit demonstrates my Christian maturity. The -4 statements are 25, Pentecostal charismatic pastors must practice servant leadership, and 14, my faith in Christ's death and resurrection makes me a Christian. The difficulty in interpreting a negative loading on the negative end of a factor causes this to be a less than useful way of looking at it. What we could do is to reverse one end of it so that we're looking at the horizontal factor as 2 different factors, and one of them is reversed from the other one. But that is one I didn't go further into. Okay, the next analysis, analysis C, is 2-factor Verimax with automatic flagging. And this is what Verimax looks like. This is what the machine gives you if you tell it to do Verimax. What does Verimax do? Verimax maximizes what is called simple structure, which was Thurstone's idea in the early days of factor analysis of the best way to understand the data. Now, his idea in the 1960s, having never thought about Q, of what is the simplest way to look at the data, may not match my idea of the simplest way to look at the data when I have a specific Q question in mind. There is nothing magic about Verimax, except that it tries to give us this group and this group that we can look at as clean factors and then treat everybody in the middle as mixed cases. Unfortunately, if you do the automatic flagging built into PQ method or built into Sean Benesek's program, it will pretty much put a line right down the middle, and every one of these sorts gets averaged into one factor or the other. If you then drew a line through the centroids of those 2 factors, you would end up drawing a line with a small angle when it's supposed to be a 90-degree angle if we wanted uncorrelated factors. In other words, the automatic flagging leads to correlated factors, and that's not what we want. It makes interpretation more difficult. So another analysis, analysis D, is the same. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I have to talk about what statements came. At 28, 24, 11 and 13 for C1, 15, 17, 9, and 30 for C2. The only one of those that you haven't heard before is number 28 and no, you did hear 15 before. 28 and 30. So even though we are doing a Verimax rotation, and these are very different factors than the unrotated ones we looked at earlier, we're getting the same statements that define how these factors are being put together. And that's not supposed to surprise us, because the distance between one person's sort and another person's sort was locked in from the time they did the sorts. And all we're doing when we make a factor is deciding which sorts we are going to average together to make the factor we need. Okay, there's a lot more here about all the distinguishing statements. I just don't have time to cover everything. Analysis D is two-factor Verimax with intelligent flagging, and this is the second best of all of the analyses that I did, in my opinion. A good factor analysis using Verimax, using intelligent flagging is quite often a very helpful way to look at it. And by the way, all of these ended up turning out to be the same statements, except for one, which gave us insight. That one was obscured when we were averaging everybody together. It's like you've got two choirs singing in the same room, and you want to understand the differences between the songs that they're singing. It's helpful to just let everybody who is confused about what songs they're singing just be quiet and lay out, and let the people who are the purest on song one and the purest on song two sing their songs, and then it's a lot easier to decipher what's going on. Okay, I give a comparison and discussion of analyses A through D before I move on to E, but I want to jump to E. Analysis E is a judgmental rotation to a probe sort. This is the idea of having a MOAFO, the student who did the study, he also did an exegesis of the original Greek of the New Testament book of Jude, and then sorted his 35 statements the way he thinks Jude would have sorted them. Now, other than a rounding error level increase in the total variance, this had no discernible effect on the scatter plots that were already there. All the existing sorts retained their original positions and approximate loadings on the first two factors. A MOAFO did not go further and use judgmental rotation. He simply used the position of the Jude sort compared to other points in factor space to bolster his understanding and interpretation of the axes of agreement and disagreement that emerged from the Q study. It gave him a way to compare the initial Q results with the view of doctrine and practice that emerged from exegesis of Jude. For the purposes of the present example, his Jude sort is included with the original 20 sorts, and judgmental rotation is used to put the vertical axis representing factor E1 directly through the dot representing sort 21. This is followed up with careful manual flagging, where only sorts 2 and 3 are used to make up factor E2, and only sorts with pure loadings greater than 0.8 on the manually rotated E1 are used to make it up. The resulting table of loadings is below, and I won't pause. You can look at that in the book. But this is what happens if you put the vertical axis directly through sort 21, which is the Jude sort. And as it turns out in this particular case, it's almost exactly like Varamax rotation. That would not always be the case. And so I go on in this paper to talk about every possible. I talk about three factors. Let me deal with that very quickly in passing. Three factors turns out just to divide factor one into two highly correlated portions, which doesn't help us at all. And then the fourth factor puts person number four, sort number four, on his own factor instead of lumping him with anybody else. So those added nothing, but I included them just to be a complete reanalysis. Then the reanalysis part two, I looked at every possible rotation of a two-factor solution for this data set. How is it possible to look at every possible rotation? Well, as it turns out, a 15-degree rotation is a 0.966 correlation from the other rotation 15 degrees away. In other words, it is so highly correlated when you only move it around by 15 degrees that it's not going to change anything by any practical means. So the 0-degree rotation turns out to be the same as unrotated PCA. The 15-degree rotation turns out to look a lot like the Jude sort. It's exactly the same, in fact. The 30-degree rotation looks like Varamax. The 45-degree rotation also looks like Varamax. The 60-degree rotation is approaching the original. This is the worst of all of the rotations, by the way, but it's approaching the original single factor solution, except that this single factor is now horizontal instead of vertical. The 75 is more so. And finally, the 90-degree rotation. When you have a 90-degree rotation, you have just duplicated what you had at the beginning, but you've relabeled the axes. Okay, that was a lot. I'm going to stop talking and give you guys a chance to ask questions. And there's Nori. Nori, I see that hand.
Hey, Mo, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Good. Good to see you here.
Thank you.
I'm glad that you can see here. I'm glad actually you presented this stimulating chart. I hope to get perhaps enough time. I don't want 45 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, actually, to answer some of the questions that you raised. First, about your data set, as you said, you have quite a small data set. It is about how many? 10, 15 people. And your results, as you presented, are quite similar. I've been a statistician for more than 30 years, and I can tell you that data can be deceiving sometimes. So if you have a small data set or large data set, you get the same results. It doesn't have to be the same thing every time. If you have a different data set, your results can be quite different when you rotate them. And depending which way you rotate them, you might get completely different set of results. That's one point that I would like to make.
Well, let me
Yeah, go ahead.
let me suggest that rather than just asserting that, you should also make a study where you take a data set that suits you and reanalyze it according to multiple ways and demonstrate what you're saying. Because according to my understanding of the underlying dynamics, the sorts that correlate will always be together no matter how you rotate them, and the factors will always be a weighted average of existing sorts.
Okay.
So therefore, you can only get what is locked in at the sorting stage.
Okay, I agree. I haven't done that. But I plan to do that. But even if I do that, whether that agrees or disagrees what we are discussing here, we cannot generalize results from one, two data set to all data set that we have. And regarding that point that we are averaging, correct, you are averaging data set, but there are many different ways of averaging data set as well. So that term should not deceive us. The other point that I would like to make, in your data set, you showed based on your data set that your results are quite similar, and it is quite similar as you showed them. Okay, I have no point that one. So my point is, or my question is, if results are not that different from each other as you're claiming it is, then why not do our analysis in one standard way so that everyone can agree with that one? Why not do in so many different ways? My point is specifically, for instance, regarding very much to judgment, or I would say hand rotation, because I have another point to make about judgmental rotation. So why not judge a very much result which is mathematically sound, with most statisticians, maybe 90% of them agree with that one, and it is more acceptable when you, for instance, do your paper. If that is the case, then why not do this one? Why so much push on doing rotation analysis, hand rotation instead of varimax? And before you say anything, let me make another point that you mentioned that I'm against judgmental rotation. In no way I am against judgmental rotation. What I disagree, I agree what is Fenton's exactly, and I said it on my papers as well, that if you have some assumptions, some guess, some hypothesis, you're allowed to do a judgmental rotation based on that assumption, and that then your assumption might be accepted or rejected. What I disagree is that you rotate the data in many different ways in any circle until you see sometimes something that makes you happy. That is what I'm against. That is not that the result should be so subjective that everyone can get his or her own result. And in the paper that we discussed before, I said that if you give a data set to 100 people, you might get, I'm not sure, I'm not saying that you will get, you might get, many different results from different people who are rotating the data set. Why not stick to a standard approach that our results can be comparable together? So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to stop.
Well, I thank you for bringing the debate that was behind this that was behind this paper directly to those who are attending. So everyone can know what we're talking about. And I have this strong, if you've studied both quantitative and qualitative methods.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
All right, you know what, Nori, would you mind muting? I think there's some.
Oh, you're right. Okay, I'm
Okay.
so sorry.
Okay. Am I talking or am I waiting for someone else? Okay. The idea that I'm trying to bring forward here is that if you've studied qualitative as well as quantitative methods, in the world of quantitative methods, it's nice if you can let the computer do everything and you can kind of get interpretations with the least amount of researcher subjectivity. In the qualitative world, there's an acknowledgement that some of that is futile. There is no such thing as a non-interpretive interpretation. What is more useful is to say, and if possible, demonstrate exactly where you're coming from and what you are comparing your interpretations to. So I think that it would be a good practice for every Q methodologist to do their own sort of the data, of the statements that they're having subjects sort, and to put that in and see where it lands among the others. It may or may not be something that you leave in for the final analysis, but it is something that will help you understand where your point is, the one you understand, relative to all of the other cloud of points. It will help you understand whether there is a bias at work that does in fact match up with what others are doing, or is there a bias at work that is out of sync with what others are doing? Because the correlation and the loading will tell you that. So rather than just guess, you actually put it into the data. So as to the issue of why not go with something standard, it is standard. It's standard in Q methodology. It was standard with William Stevenson. It's standard with Stephen Brown. And I'm trying to help people who are coming from other like statistical backgrounds to understand why it's a standard and should be a standard in Q methodology. Okay, so I don't want to spend the whole time arguing with experts. Are there some questions from some of the students?
Nabil, I see your hand up.
Hey, hello.
Hello.
Yeah, I'm a PhD student, and I think I do have the same data set that you just presented. And my question is, how did you choose to retain the factors that you analyzing right now? Why? I mean, which criteria that you use to decide how many factors that you have selected?
Okay. Remember that I'm suggesting that a factor should be conceptualized in a Q methodology way, meaning that it is a shared point of view. In order for it to be a shared point of view, you need to have at least two people who share that point of view. Okay, so if you have a factor that doesn't have at least two people on it, you can ignore that factor, unless the one person who's on there is on there for a particular strategic reason. All right, so the next thing is, it's not about variance. This is going to irritate those from our factor analysis backgrounds, but let me make it very clear. In Q methodology, our P set is selected purposefully, and it is not necessarily representative of the size of a point of view in the larger population. And yet, the size of a factor in terms of variance or in terms of eigenvalue is completely related to how many in our P set happen to have that point of view. So statistically, a point of view with only two people on it is much weaker than a point of view with 5 people on it. But that point of view with only 2 people on it may be the one that you did the study to find. You need to know why you're doing the study, and don't throw away data until you've checked the possibility of does adding another factor to my analysis do a better job of answering the question for which I originally set out to do the study. So these are not the answers that you will get from the R world, but these, to me, and Stephen Brown may want to comment. These to me are the most important considerations.
I'm going to jump in here real quick. Hi, everybody. Sorry I'm late. Just because we are on the hour. What I'd love to do is just offer it. Bob, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. But I'd like to offer it maybe to Stephen to add, as Bobby suggested, if you wanted to add to that, Stephen, and then we'll have just a soft close and a thank you, and then people can stay on a little bit longer for some follow-up questions. So maybe Stephen, to you.
I'm quite willing to let Bob go. He's doing a marvelous job.
Okay.
Plus, it's very nice to have some other people being shot at.
All right. Well, with that, since we are on the hour, we'd love to let people leave if they do need to. So just a round of applause. Thank you so much, Bob, for this wonderful presentation. I can tell you I'm going to be listening to the recording while reading along with the book several times over. I'm sure many of us will. And so, yeah, thank you. And do you have a little bit more time to stay with us and maybe answer more questions?
Sure.
Okay, so for those who are heading out, thank you all so much for joining. We'll have another wonderful presentation next month. And we also always have weekly informal meetings as well that you can come and join. And my name is Miku. Sorry, I was late. Stephanie opened the room up for us here, but I'm one of the main facilitators for our SimQ seminars. So, okay, yeah. Thanks, Vivian. Thanks, everybody. Good to see you guys. And okay, so with that, Rowella has her hand up. Yeah, so is that where we left off, or Bob, do we need to go back to you?
That's fine.
Yeah, all right, let's go to Rowella.
Thank you very much. It's Rula, but it doesn't matter if it's pronounced differently. So thank you very much, Dr. Braswell. That was so informative and interesting. And thank you for is it Yusuf who asked that questions about how do you know how many factors? So I'm busy with my PhD, and I've done all the sorts and so on, and I've done I've extracted, but I only used PCA and is it now Verimax? So the words are still PCA and Verimax. I've only done those, and I did it on 8 factors, and then I looked at 5 factors and 4 and 3 and 2 to try and figure out
Let me
how
pause
many
right.
factors I need to.
Let me ask you, I'm sorry to interrupt, but are you rerunning Verimax with each of these numbers?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yep.
That's good.
Yeah. So, so I see that. Let me call it. So I've watched all Dr. Ramlow's videos, and when she shows, for example, the factors and the readings, then she would say, this looks good. So it took me at least 2 weeks to figure out what looks good and what doesn't look good. So I'm really, it's really very interesting. And my focus is on qualitative and not on quantitative, but the quantitative, of course, will influence my qualitative. So my question is this, and this is such a stupid question, forgive me. If I have less factors, it seems as if the thoughts are more in focus than when I have more factors. And I'm doing it with a PQ method. I'm not using that other fancy one. Am I right when I'm saying this, or is it? I don't know if you understand my question.
I think so. When you have fewer factors, it is easier for you to conceptualize the distinctions among the factors relative to each other. And that's always going to be the case. If I have 5 factors, I have to hold 5 factors in my head, along with their similarities and differences, in order to be able to distinguish them. There are a lot of factors out there that you don't need to feel obligated to talk about, because the factors that you need are the ones that answer your research questions.
Okay, excellent. Thank you
Yeah.
very much. That is, you've
Let me
helped
underline
me
that
so
with
much.
good. Let me underline that with something. I think Stephen Brown said this to me one time. Quantitative versus qualitative is in every study, no matter how quantitative. Nobody can tell you what to be interested in, but as soon as you decide what you're interested in, that's a qualitative decision. Okay, so the issue of what factors should be interpreted is also driven by the same issue of what answers the research question that set me on this study in the first place.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian.
Oh, yes. Other questions or just reflections for Bob?
I would like to point out just one thing. It is quite possible for the first unrotated principal components to be bipolar.
Yes.
And that is in a situation in which the audience is terrifically polarized, like on pro-life, pro-choice. You go out and give a Q-sort on, on abortion, you're going to get a strong bipolarity. And if you did that with the principal components, that first factor is going to reflect. So I think it takes out the first factor that accounts for the most variance. Usually it is monopolar, but it's quite possible for it to be bipolar. Usually is not bipolar, but it.
Well, I can just add here real quickly that the debate that we saw here is what's always frustrated me a bit about Q, and defending Q to people who don't understand any of this and just say, oh, it's just subjective and you're just finding what you're looking for, because there's not, there's not a standard way to analyze the data, right? I mean, we just saw that in this debate, that there can be multiple ways to analyze the data, which for qualitative people makes sense and is fine. But quantitative people don't like that. They want something clear cut. They can be replicated. They can be reproduced.
But let me just clarify a second. It is replicated. No matter how you reanalyze it, you come back to the same statements that made people group together. And what I'm trying to say is the idea that making a different decision about rotation will lead to a completely different conclusion is a misunderstanding, because what will happen is you will either get a particularly well-focused answer if you do a good analysis, or an out-of-focus answer if you do a bad analysis, but it will be the same answer. And the idea that it's just subjectivity, it's not the researcher's subjectivity, it is the sorter's subjectivity made observable at the time of the sort.
Yeah, I don't think any of us disagree with that. I'm always looking at this from the standpoint of people who have doctoral committees and who are trying to get things published. And they always run up against this kind of analysis thing. And that is, and one time, it's been a long time ago, but I actually used the same data set and ran it through 2 different programs, and they weren't the same. They didn't come out the same. And that didn't make any sense to me. And, I didn't spend enough time working on it to actually see if I'd made some kind of error, or if it was the way the rotations were moving that were different in the different software, or if there was some mathematical underlying that made things different depending on the program you were using. That's always bothered me. And I've always planned to get back to it and try it again in some different ways and look at what happens. But I've just never, ever had the opportunity to do that. But I do think it is kind of, I mentioned this, I don't know when it was, last week or sometime, that I do see this as one of the major things that needs to be continually explained in Q, especially for students who are learning to use Q and are having to deal with particularly committees or people who are not in favor of Q. And I mean, I ran into that myself at the University of Missouri, where Stevenson was, and everybody understood him. And I still had faculty members who basically said it was bunk. So, you need a scientific way to talk about it, which Stevenson really tried very hard to do. If you read his papers, he was always talking about the scientific underpinning, therefore the scientific study of subjectivity. But I'm not sure that we explain that well enough.
If I might add something, Judith Sylvester is quite right. The critics are very happy to they will be absolutely delighted with their findings, even if they are wrong. They'll be happy because they did it right. That is, they can reach wrong conclusions, but they did it right, and they'll be happy with that. I don't think there are very many Q methodologists would be happy if it turned out a particular way that just made no sense. You would say, well, there's some other kind of way to rotate this that will bring something to light that's more sensible. There's that paper that I wrote with Rick Robine, took a statement out of the study of behavior that was Stevenson actually quoting Cantor, leaving some room for reality. Veromax principal components, those aren't reality, those are statistics. But what about leaving some room in here, not just for statistical principles, but for reality? The organizational consultant, who goes into an organization has interviewed all these people, and he has some sort of sense about what is going on in this organization. There's got to be some room for that in the analysis, not just to get a statistical solution, but to give one that is somehow related to reality. So that's one thing to ponder. But if I could, in keeping with what you said about committees and some people thinking it's bunk and so forth, you're absolutely right. And so is it Roella? Is that your name? Roella. I would start off with just two factors, principal components, two factors, see if that accounts for is everybody on those two factors statistically significantly, and nobody's left out. If so, go with that, because it explains everybody. If you've taken out two factors and there's still 5 or 6 people who aren't significant, that may mean that they may be on the third factor. So take out a third factor, and now see if that includes everyone. I wouldn't go beyond 4 or 5 because it gets more complicated. Stevenson also had an idea that some data could be overly explained. He quoted C.S. Lewis, that if you explain roses in terms of the bacteria and so forth in the soil, you've overanalyzed the problem. What about the beauty of the roses? You don't have to talk about the bacteria in the soil or how much water was added or anything like that. That's what you're overanalyzing the situation. And so using principal components, Veromax, with whatever number of factors that explain things is things committees are going to understand. Reviewers of journals that you may submit to are going to understand. They're not going to ask you any questions, even though that's just as arbitrary as a judgmental rotation. But for students who are starting off, I usually say, go the quick and dirty way. Principal components, Veromax, nobody's going to question you. We'll go right through. This is not your magnum opus, this is your dissertation. and it's not that the principal components is giving you a wrong answer. It's giving you an answer from a particular perspective, like Bob indicates.
Yeah.
You rotate a different kind of way. You're looking at the same thing. What if you want to look at it from a Marxian standpoint, or from a religious standpoint, or from a psychoanalytic standpoint? Those may lead to different rotations. None of them is wrong. They're just an understanding of the data from a particular slant. And so I would go with the simplest kind of way. It's not wrong. It may not be the best way to look at it. It may not be the most insightful way. It may be a way that conceals some aspects of the data that a judgmental rotation would reveal. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means that you haven't looked at it in some other kind of way that may bring more features of the reality to light. Sorry, I didn't mean to go on and on.
No, thank you, Dr. Brown. That is absolutely amazing what you just said. And I hope I understand correctly, because that was actually my other question, but I felt it was so stupid I couldn't ask it.
No.
If it seems that what I've done already have clearly created factors that, of course, the interpretation and all of that must still happen. Do I need to use centroid and hand rotation, or can I do a PhD analysis without going centroid? And because I've tried that and it makes me crazy. I just feel I don't know enough to know, should it be 15% or should it be, but what Dr. Bob just shared with us made so much sense, but I'm not, I do not want to spend all the energy. I think there's so much energy that needs to go into the actual interpretation of the different factors and the in-depth dialogues I had afterwards, where people explained what they thought of the different aspects and so on. And that is immensely interesting. So it's maybe coming back to the point of what am I looking at? So the focus on my study is actually dialogic learning and narratives of becoming. So strategic communicators. So it's not necessarily, so the different factors are important, but there are narratives within that I need to focus on. So if I could continue without doing centroid and hand rotation, I'll be ecstatic.
Yes.
I will give you permission. You have my permission.
I'm quoting you on
my
that.
blessing.
The thing that I push for more than hand, first of all, centroid factor analysis. There are theoretical reasons to prefer it, but there are no practical reasons to prefer it. Okay, so I think you might as well not worry about that one. But the idea of doing a study without ever looking at the scatter plots, to me, is trying to interpret or trying to make a jigsaw puzzle without ever looking at the picture on the box. It's the attempt to interpret the agreements and disagreements without looking at how people clumped together. And so for me, the issue of judgmental rotation is not so much the judgmental rotation itself. It's getting into looking at the plots and understanding what's going on in your data in a way that if you just click Verimax, you can avoid ever looking at a plot. And I think that's like interpreting with a blindfold on.
Thank you very much.
I'm being very opinionated here, and Stephen Brown is still on the call, so I don't know whether I'm getting away with it.
Well, I wanted to kind of poke at this just a little bit, because when you're looking at your scatter plot, and the ones you showed us, the ones that are in the book, they're flat. They're right there. But the reason to do hand rotation ever is to figure out how it actually works mathematically. I don't think it does any help at all with actually interpreting it, but it helps you understand the mathematics behind it. But here's the problem, is you really need a 3D thing, because, okay, you might have person one who's way up here in the same factor, and you might have person two who's way back here in the same factor, but in the scatter plots, they look like this. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
I forget that I have to have a camera. So instead of being 3D, they're this. But maybe there's some significant difference between this person over here, sorry, and this person back here, just because the distance is more than the scatter plot allows you to see, if that makes sense. So that's one of the reasons that I like the actual flagged part of that, because it gives me at least a point of who is the highest on it, and you see how many people are doing that. And then you can start to look at, well, what are the real distances between these people? Why are they in the same factor when they haven't actually, put the same statements in the first spot, right? Maybe most people put it in the first spot, but a lot of people put it in the second spot. But when you average it, those still come out as really high, important statements. So
let me see what Rita's
kind of
question is. If you don't mind, Judith, let me see what Rita's question is, and then if you're still available, I can come back and show you a rotation as we discuss it.
Yeah, I'm also interested in this tailored conversation with Judy. So my question is thinking about what I heard today is a question. It's kind of, I know that there is no sense to think about a fixed recipe to do things. Doesn't make any sense when we are dealing with subjective behaviors. We need to be sensitive to relate to the research question and also what actually people do. But in our analysis, I have these two questions for you. So if it's possible in the study, do you think it would be always good to have an expert, someone that provide a sort, the ideal sort related to our research question, so that when we analyze the data, we can do these rotations to see how the community we are investigating adjust to it, if it's possible, of course. And the second question, I wonder if I can kind of summarize the use of these PCA, centroid, varimax, judgmental in the following way. Again, without being obsessed and being rigid. So can we associate the PCA with the varimax rotation, while if I'm using the centroid, would be more nicer to try to use a judgmental rotation? Namely, if I'm running a PCA, would it make any sense to still try to apply a hand rotation, or what I'm saying doesn't make any sense in terms of techniques relate with the conceptual, the theoretical roots we want to keep? That's it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let me start with the second one. The matrix algebra of PCA is a very simple way to get the biggest factor first. Then after you've accounted for the biggest factor, you account for the second. It is guaranteed that you will always get the biggest factor first in PCA. All right. That is why PCA is an answer. It is a mathematical answer. Okay. But the biggest factor will also be the one that you accidentally had the most sorters agree with. And so the way you choose your P set, your persons who do the sorting, will completely dominate what's happening with PCA. The theoretical reasons to choose centroid are that, first of all, you, instead of having unities, one on the diagonal of the matrix, so that each person's sort correlated with himself is a 1.0, you replace that 1.0 with a reliability estimate or a measure of the amount of communality estimate, so that on the diagonals, instead of ones, you have smaller numbers. This guarantees that you're going to get smaller loadings if you do CFA. Also, CFA does not guarantee that all the factors after the first will come out in order. It's possible to have a smaller factor 2 and then a larger factor 3 in CFA. Okay. Those are practical issues. if people are going to gripe at you about having too small an eigenvalue in a factor you kept, you don't want to use PCA. You want to use, you don't want to use centroid. You want to use PCA, which will artificially inflate that eigenvalue by using the ones on the diagonal. Okay, that the theoretical reason to prefer centroid before you do a rotation is that principal components is already an answer. To get that mathematical answer and then rotate it is to break what you just did. The idea of principal components is to get the biggest factor first. We'll stop. Okay. Varimax the answer you get with Varimax depends on how many factors you rotate. So if you rotate 4 factors using Varimax and then throw away 2, you get a different answer than if you rotate 2 factors using Varimax. So that I guess what I'm trying to say is these are the technical issues for one versus the other, but as Stephen Brown has already said, if you're working on a PhD, do what your committee is going to be comfortable with, and usually that's PCA and Varimax. Now, on the idea of always including an expert sorter, I think that will depend on your research and what your research questions are. But I would think it would be a very good idea many times to include an expert sorter, maybe more than one, or maybe the same expert under multiple conditions of instruction. So that you're asking him the first time, how would you sort these statements according to your understanding? And then the second time, what do you think the ideal would be? Because his answer about the ideal may be different than his answer about his own view. And you can include that kind of information to help you interpret the other statements. But again, you wouldn't always want to interpret from the point of view of relative to an expert. Sometimes that's just not relevant.
But in case, this is a very interesting idea to have the expert answering, sorting under 2 different conditions. But given that you have that, would you run those 2 sorts with all the others?
Yes.
Okay.
And one of my students did a study where he had a group of church planters in Sweden sort a bunch of statements about the right way to plant a church, the ideal way to plant a church. So he asked them to sort, here's a bunch of scripture about church planting, and here's a bunch of practice about church planting, and these are all involved in these statements, and sort these statements according to what you believe is the ideal way to plant a church in Sweden. And then after they finished that sort, he said, okay, would you please do another sort for me? Would you sort these in terms of what you actually did? All of these were guys who had planted churches, but he is asking them to sort once in terms of their ideal and a second time in terms of what they actually did. And all of these can be put into the same analysis. You can see relative to each other, did they correlate? Did they clump together? or were they far apart?
Prediction. The ideals were on a single factor.
Thank you.
And the others were on different factors.
There was pretty much an ideal factor, yes. Actually, there was an ideal factor and two different practice factors.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So, Bob, we've kept you for a little while now. How are you doing?
I'm good. If you need to end the call, I'll behave myself, but I'm still here if you're willing to put up with it.
I need to head off, but I know Judith, you had sort of your question. I was wondering, would there be interest in maybe meeting back for one of the weeklies to go into some things further? I don't know what your availability is. This is also so precious. I can just kind of like, I don't know. I mean, I can just take my camera off and you guys can keep going.
I kind of need to get going because I
Okay.
just, kind of walked into the house and joined this group. So I've had a long day, but I kind of expressed, I guess, what my interest is here. And I keep coming back to what Mike kept saying about trying to visualize Q. How do you visualize Q? And I wish I could not just see it as a 3D model, but understand what it meant as a 3D model, to have people that are in the same quadrant, but maybe not equal space. They look like they're right on top of each other, but they're actually not. If that makes any sense. I'm not a mathematician, so I get lost pretty fast with some of the really technical things.
Let me give you.
But I just, I've always wanted to know more about what I was doing when I ran a thing, but I've always been relatively satisfied with my interpretations when it was all said and done. But there's a lot of things that we haven't talked about that can throw things off, like balance, there's a lot of things that can throw things off. So that's the other thing too, is just looking for ways to minimize the things that can throw us off, I guess, is always useful. And yet I don't think that we'd ever reach that point where we were all in total agreement about how to do something.
I wish that people would hang on to a grounding of what the numbers mean, instead of getting distracted by the numbers. It just hang on to that. That's why I use the idea of the populated grid as the image to hold in mind when you're thinking about a Q factor. It's a composite sort, populated. You can taste it by looking at which statements are where throughout that sort. You can understand it, you can interpret it. And if you stop short of that with numbers or scatter plots or any of those other things that I really like, you disassociate the importance from the numbers. So I just wanted to hold something up here. This is a bag of grapes. And this is first principal component. The first principal component is how high is my bag of grapes above the axis. If I want to look at factor 2, I do this. That's what's happening when you look at 1 versus 2. I'm sorry, 1 versus 3. Are you with me? This is 1 versus 2. This width, the width of my baggie of grapes is factor 2. The height of my baggie of grapes is factor 1. And this dimension is factor 3. Now, I can't tell you how to visualize more than 3 dimensions, but the first 3 are are fairly easy. And when you plot 2 versus 3, you end up looking down at it from the top, something like that. Okay, so all of that to say, it's not that hard. Just keep playing with the plots until they start to make sense to you, until you start to understand what everything means. Because if it's just numbers, that's what causes people to say crazy things about our method applied to Q.
I gotta go.
Okay,
Aw, thank you so
all
much.
right.
Is
Well,
that,
thanks to
yeah, that-
everyone for sticking around. And
Great job, Bob.
I'm gonna sign off. Thank you, Stephen.
thank you so much, Bob. Thank you, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Good to
Bye.
see you all. Take care, and we'll see you again next time.
All right.
All right. Bye now.
Bye.